Okay, so the other essay option we have, which personally is my favourite, and I think if I had been doing this essay, this is the one I would have chosen. So write an essay on the importance of energy transfer within and between organisms. So this is really important. It's got two parts. So energy transfers is the focus. So energy being transferred from one form to another. Light energy to chemical energy, for example. Chemical energy to kinetic energy. And that's got to happen within, so inside organisms, and between organisms, so from one organism to another. So for example, feeding, where one organism is going to eat another organism in order to get chemical energy, which they then use to help them produce their own energy through respiration. The importance is really, really key. And this is why a lot of these essay questions are using this word now at the start, because you need the why. If you're talking about, it's not just a case of just tell me everything you know about energy transfers and that topic. You need to say why these energy transfers are important with kind of scientific knowledge. So my plan, I'm going to try and focus on the paragraphs I'm going to write. And I think there's kind of three main areas, but they will probably end up as larger paragraphs or potentially more paragraphs. So I'm thinking about kind of starting going through the food chain almost. So start with producers, because that's where light energy is converted into chemical energy. So start with photosynthesis. It's really easy to think about energy transfers in there because we've got electron transfer chain, we've got photolysis, so light energy is being used to split water, the electrons passing along the electron transfer chain, the energy is being used to create ATP, so it's photophosphorylation. The ionizing of chlorophyll, so that energy from light is used to transfer the light energy to excite the electrons, get them to a higher energy level so they can leave the chlorophyll. All of these are energy transfers. If you make sure you talk about them like that as you write them, that will be answering the question. The importance of this, and this is the thing I will tell you, is absolutely necessary. When you are planning your paragraphs and planning your essay, everything you write must have an importance link next to it. Because if you can't think of importance, it shouldn't be in your essay. And if you can't think of an importance or you don't write one down, you won't put it in the essay, and that means that section of your essay will be counted as irrelevant or not linked to the question. So we can't get into that top mark bracket. So obviously the importance of photosynthesis in general is how producers start all food chains. They are the source of chemical energy for every consumer. So if we didn't have plants doing that process, we wouldn't have chemically available energy in the form of glucose. So then I'm thinking about transferring from producers to consumers, because that covers my between organisms, and I get that in early in the essay, which means I'm definitely going to be able to have time to cover it. So food chains, transfer of energy through digestion of biomass, the wasting of energy, how energy is not transferred through those food chains and it's lost to the environment. We can talk about GPP and MPP in farming. This is all making this A-level standard, because remember, we could just end up talking about food chains like a GCSE level, and we don't want to do that. So GPP, NPP, or GP and NP, farming, the conservation of energy through farming practices to make sure we're increasing the energy transfer in food, energy losses through heat, respiration, not eating all of an organism, why energy is lost at each level of the food chain. Why is this important? Well, it's important for the food chain of humans. It's important to make sure that if we're doing these practices in farming, we're trying to get as much energy transfer into the food and that we're eating as possible. It's also kind of a link to other things like the carbon cycle, kind of energy moving through, and then energy that's wasted and obviously comes out in feces and stuff can end up going to decomposers and being recycled. But the other thing is obviously digestion and eating and consuming of organisms is really important, because that means we get the glucose in order to make ATP in respiration. And then that's a nice link then to our next paragraph, which will be respiration. So you can see here how I've decided to talk about my topics, and I could have bullet pointed just the topics like photosynthesis, respiration, energy transfer, like all the topics from the energy transfer topic, and then sorted these out. So obviously this has taken a bit of thought on my part before I started writing this level of plan down, but that's what I'd suggest you do. You look at both of them on the paper, you write some sort of brief bullet points about the main big topics you think will be included, see how confident you feel about writing about those in detail, and then you make this plan where you get a bit more granular about what you're going to include, because you can't include everything. And then you can start thinking about how to order those paragraphs to help you make that nice, flowing, fluid story that means that your essay is very clear and cohesive and one whole synoptic kind of essay, that all of it answers the question because you're going from one thing to another. So then I'm going to do converting chemical energy to ATP in respiration. So we're taking the chemical energy in bonds of glucose and we're converting it to the energy that's locked in the bonds of ATP. So we've got, again, similar process to the photosynthesis. We've got oxidative phosphorylation. We've got phosphorylating of glucose to make it more reactive. So the uses of ATP here as well. And energy losses here. So why is it not efficient? Why is the energy transfer in respiration not efficient? How can we end up making, we don't make the total amount of ATP we should. So the importance, obviously, is that you need ATP for energy requiring processes, which then takes us to more energy transfers, where everywhere where ATP is used, it releases energy and that energy is transferred to do something. So then you just see some examples of uses of ATP because they're all energy conversions or energy transfers. So I think muscle contraction is a nice one because you can talk about chemical energy going to kinetic energy to move and contract those muscles. So talking about the use of ATP to move the myosin heads and then detach the myosin heads and allow that shortening of the sarcomere, I think is a really nice one. Active transport, again, is another form of kinetics. So we're moving molecules from one place to another. So you've got the movement of glucose, active transport of glucose in the small intestine, which links all the way back then to digestion and food chains, which is nice. Or sodium potassium pump in nerves, maintaining concentration, resting potential. Again, really, really important. And there's nice importance links there. So muscle contraction is important for movement, which is important to be able to get prey and do the digestion and eating to get that chemical energy. Also things like the heart is a muscle, the heart contraction, that's important. It beats, it moves blood around the body, and that's important for delivering the oxygen needed for respiration and the glucose, which is again, nice kind of cyclical story there. Active transport, sending impulses is really important. So being able to maintain resting potential so that then depolarization can occur, changing it, and therefore we can sense our environment, respond to the environment, or obviously absorbing glucose or mineral ions from roots and things like that. So getting the nutrients and minerals we need in order to then carry out these processes that require it, like respiration. So I'm just kind of quickly adding up how many kind of topics I've covered or will cover in this, because I've got to make sure I'm covering 4 separate topics, which I am with my 4 paragraphs. So even within that, I've got kind of the food chains is one, and then the whole GPP and MPP and kind of farming is another one, because it's a whole other spec point. Converting chemical energy to ATP and respiration is a spec point. Talk about muscle contraction, spec point. Active transport, another spec point. And then I need to think about where am I going to include my beyond the spec information. Now, this is not vital. If doing all of this and getting all of this level of detail for all of this stuff to get into this essay it's still challenging. So there's not, I would say, unless you are someone who's got all of this content down and is really excellent at writing these synoptic essays, I wouldn't spend too much time stressing about learning enough beyond the spec content that you can have at your fingertips to apply to any essay question. I don't think it's worth the hours and the extra time that would do if you don't know all of the content you're supposed to know well enough and in enough detail to get it. You won't get into that top part of the bracket of the marking system anyway. But this is me doing it so that you can see what an example would look like. So one of the only main things I can think of here for extra content was talking about photorespiration. So photorespiration is not in the AQA spec. So talking about how that actually, the failure of Rubisco to be not exclusive to be have carbon dioxide as a substrate, and how in high temperatures, when oxygen builds up in leaves, it can actually bind with Rubisco, and we do photorespiration instead, which limits the energy transfer. So that wastes the light energy that was absorbed, because products of the Calvin cycle are used to then regenerate and sort out photorespiration to actually make sure that we can still make glucose from it. So I thought that was nice because it actually links into this idea of energy transfers, and it talks about the lack of energy transfer efficiency in photosynthesis. So that's where I'm going to add my extra content in. Like I said, that would be where I'd go sort of as my last point of call if I knew I could confidently do it and if I knew it was related to the question. There is no point throwing extra facts into these essays if they are not directly related to the question. Okay, so I've talked a lot about this, but in reality, you think about that plan and how quickly that plan was. That plan was about 10 minutes. So I'm saying that that plan would be about 10 minutes once you've chosen the question and having already thought a bit about what you're going to include. So this is why I'm saying start of the exam, go to the back, look at the 2 essay questions, brain dump your first thoughts or your first major topics, 4 topics that you think you'd include. So this one was obviously photosynthesis, food chains, respiration, ATP, or ATP usage. That's my 4 things I would have written down. I could have written down some more and crossed them out, but that's what I would have written down at the start. I'd have written down some bullet points for the question 6, and then I would have just decided, like, gone and done the rest of the paper, come back with about 35 minutes left of the time left on the exam, unless I finished earlier than that, which is great, and then written out this plan, taking myself 10 minutes to write the plan, so I've then got 25 minutes to write this out in the detail that it needs to be written out in. Okay, so this is my first paragraph. I do have a very, very, very brief 2-sentence introduction. It's really not necessary, and do not waste time on an introduction, especially if you're going to end up talking about things that are not relevant or you'll be repeating yourself later on. Energy transfers are necessary in living organisms to maintain life, as all essential life processes and chemical reactions require energy in different forms. ATP is used as the biological energy currency, so energy transfers can be seen anywhere this molecule is produced or used. Energy flow through ecosystems begins with the capturing of light energy and the transfer into chemical energy in the form of glucose and other molecules, which make up the biomass of plants. This is achieved through the process of photosynthesis. The light energy is absorbed by photosynthetic pigment molecules arranged in photosystems found in the thylakoid membrane of chloroplasts. The energy from photons is used to excite electrons in a chlorophyll A molecule, which raises them to a higher energy state so that they can leave their electron shells. Light energy is also used to split water into protons, electrons, and oxygen. The electrons are used to replace those lost from chlorophyll A at photosystem 2. The excited electrons pass along a series of proteins called the electron transport chain through coupled redox reaction. The energy lost from these reactions is used to actively pump protons across the thylakoid membrane, creating an electrochemical gradient. This transfer of energy results in the movement of protons down their concentration gradient through the ATP synthase enzyme. This kinetic energy is transferred into the chemical bond formed between ADP and inorganic phosphate to produce a molecule of ATP. This process is known as photophosphorylation. Light energy is also absorbed at photosystem 1, where the electrons in another chlorophyll A molecule are excited and this time are used along with protons to reduce the coenzyme NADP. The reduced NADP and ATP made in these light-dependent reactions are then used in the Calvin cycle, where carbon dioxide is fixed by the enzyme Rubisco and combined with the molecule of RUBP. Through a series of reduction steps, including the transfer of energy from ATP, this molecule is converted into triose phosphate, which can then be used to construct organic molecules, including glucose. So main things I want you to get from this paragraph. I have really briefly mentioned the Calvin cycle, an overview of the Calvin cycle. I've not gone into detail as it's not relevant, and there wouldn't be many opportunities to talk about energy transfer there. I talked about most of my energy transfer in the light-dependent reactions that I've talked about. So don't waste time saying everything you know about photosynthesis here. It's not worth it. You need to make it linked to the question. You'll notice all the pink I've highlighted is everywhere where I've talked about transferring of energy. And I've been very clear to use those words, transfer of energy, everywhere I can. Talking about moving it to kinetic energy, talking about this transfer is used for movement, this transfer is used to do this, construct ATP. That's what this question is like getting at, and start strong with something like this where you can get loads of those really clear signposted into it. I needed to talk about the construction of organic molecules, including glucose, because that's going to link to respiration later on and also help me go into the next paragraph. All of that light-dependent reaction is the level of detail you need. It's A-level detail, it's correct, and it's linked to the question. This is what these essays are about. You describing steps, processes in really nice A-level correct detail that you show off what you've learned, but that it has to be relevant to the question. And that can't just be tagging a sentence on the start or the end saying, this is important because, and now I'm just going to tell you everything I know. I was very deliberate in my language here and how I wrote about this in order to make sure it was relevant to answering the question. So this is then my extra bit that I'm adding on to the end of this paragraph, which is my beyond the spec information about photorespiration that I spoke about in the plan. I've separated it because without it, this essay would still be high scoring, and you don't, as I said, need to really stress about including that extra content unless you are really super confident with all the content you need to know in order to be able to get high marks in the essay. This is just sort of icing on the cake, gets you that sort of 24, 25 marks out of 25. This form of photosynthesis, C3, is energy inefficient at high temperatures, as rubisco can bind to oxygen as well as carbon dioxide. In high temperature environments when stomata must close to prevent water loss, oxygen can build up in leaves and bind to RUBP instead of carbon dioxide. This is inefficient and wastes about 25% of the products of photosynthesis and therefore the light energy absorbed to make them, as ATP and amino acids are needed to convert the products back to G3P for it to continue in the Calvin cycle. This process is known as photorespiration as it uses oxygen and produces carbon dioxide. So that's it. It's more than one sentence. It's linked to the question because I talked about energy being wasted, light energy that's being used is being wasted to do this process. So it's linked to energy transfer and it's relevant and it's not on the AQA specification. Then I'm finishing my paragraph with an importance link to the question as like an overall sum up, ready to go into the next one. So despite its inefficiency at high temperatures, photosynthesis is a vital process to all life as producers are the source of chemical energy for all heterotrophic organisms. Okay, so this is a link back to the question, why is photosynthesis important? That is what that sentence says, and it's also going to link really nicely into my next paragraph about food chains. The efficiency of energy transfer from light to chemical energy, or biomass in plants, can be measured as gross primary productivity. Only about 1 to 5% of the light energy available from the sun is transferred to chemical energy in photosynthesis. A lot is lost through reflection of light not hitting photosynthetic pigments, and sunlight passing through plant tissues. Some GPP is also lost through respiration in plants. Farmers try to maximise the productivity and yield of crops to increase the energy transfer to humans. They do this by reducing competition with other plants, spraying herbicides, increasing plant growth by adding fertilisers to soils, and reducing yield losses to pests or pathogens using pesticides or biocontrol agents and fungicides. The transfer of chemical energy through food chains from producers to consumers is also inefficient, as only about 10% energy is transferred to each trophic level. This is measured as the net productivity. Some energy is lost as not all parts of plants or animals are eaten. For example, roots and bones and some biomass travels through the gut undigested and is lost in feces. Most energy lost is used for respiration, movement, or maintaining body temperature in consumers instead of being transferred to chemical bonds in new molecules to produce new biomass, which would then be available to the next trophic level. This limits the number of trophic levels in a food chain as there is simply not enough energy available for organisms to survive past 5 levels, as the decrease in net productivity is too great. Livestock farmers can use the knowledge of energy losses to improve the efficiency of energy transfer to humans as the secondary consumers by restricting movement and keeping animals warm to reduce the amount of energy lost through respiration. Maximising the net productivity or net primary productivity available to the next trophic level means more light energy has been transferred and stored as chemical energy in bonds of organic molecules, which will be available to the next trophic level to be used in respiration, which is essential for producing the ATP needed for energy requiring reactions on a cellular level. So that last sentence is quite long. I think I should put more punctuation in there. It's an importance link. So it's importance of why making sure we get enough energy from our food, or making sure that there is enough energy in our food and maximizing it through farming practices is really important for humans. And then it links really nicely to respiration and ATP, which is what's going to happen in the next paragraph. This whole paragraph, you can see everywhere where I've talked about transfer of energy, this whole paragraph could be at a risk of being GCSE level content if it wasn't for me talking about net productivity and gross productivity, which is clearly A-level content, talking about minimizing the respiratory losses, using kind of language like biomass, which isn't always used at GCSE as well, and just really kind of hammering home that idea of obviously chemical energy being locked up in bonds, chemical energy being available through glucose, and then talking about this idea of net productivity and what's actually passed on. So this is really important because it's the only paragraph here as well that links to this idea of between organisms. Unless you were going to potentially talk about digestion, you could go into a bit of detail there, but this was the easiest way I could think about to link it to energy transfer. Respiration itself also involves many energy transfers in the process of producing large amounts of ATP. In the cytoplasm, 2 molecules of ATP are used to phosphorylate glucose to make it more reactive and form fructose bisphosphate. As this molecule is now unstable, it splits into 2 molecules of triose phosphate, which are oxidized to pyruvate. The oxidation releases 4 molecules of ATP and reduces 2 molecules of NAD, which gives a net gain of 2 ATP for the process of glycolysis. The reduced NAD and the pyruvate enter the mitochondria, and the Krebs cycle is used to decarboxylase and oxidize compounds to produce more reduced NAD and FAD. The energy from the original glucose molecule is now stored in the bonds of these reduced coenzymes. The coenzymes travel to the electron transport chain in the cristae, where they are oxidized, and their lost electrons move along a chain of cytochromes through a series of redox reactions. This process is known as oxidative phosphorylation and is used to make ATP in the same way as photophosphorylation through chemiosmosis. It uses protons donated from the reduced coenzymes and requires oxygen to be the final electron acceptor in the electron transport chain. So briefly, I've written this note on the side. Do not waste time repeating exactly the same information that we talked about when we talked about photophosphorylation, because it's not worth your time and you've just repeated the same knowledge and content. So don't bother here. Make sure you're using your time to talk about something else related to energy transfer. So like photosynthesis, the process of respiration is also inefficient. In theory, 38 molecules of ATP can be produced from 1 molecule of glucose, because each reduced NAD should provide enough energy for 3 ATP, and each reduced FAD should provide enough energy for 2 ATP to be produced through ATP synthase. However, the net gain of ATP from 1 molecule of glucose is 32 ATP. This is because ATP is used throughout the process to transport ATP and pyruvate from the cytoplasm into the matrix of the mitochondria, and to transport ATP back from the mitochondria into the matrix to be used by the cell. Energy transfer is therefore incredibly important in respiration because the production of ATP is required to help the process of respiration to occur and produce large amounts of ATP required for many metabolic processes in the cell. Again, importance of respiration here, importance of energy transfer, why it's important to respiration, and then also why is respiration important? Oh, because it's producing ATP, which we need for metabolic processes, which is the link to the next paragraph. As I'm reading this, I could have made more of the use of ATP in respiration, talked more in detail about active transport there, so active transport of pyruvate in ADP, and talked about how active transport is actually involving an energy transfer from ATP, because then that would be another thing I could have mentioned there, a little bit more detail, and also that covers another topic. Final paragraph. 2 important uses of ATP in cells are nervous signaling and muscle contraction, which are vital for organisms to be able to move and respond to their environment, but also muscle contraction of the heart is necessary to produce the force to move blood around organisms to deliver oxygen and dissolve substances to all cells in the body. So this is kind of an important sentence. I've not gone into detail and I've not used these to talk about energy transfer. What I have said here is linking this idea of nervous signaling and muscle contraction to importance. I'm going to go and talk about muscle contraction, not nervous signaling. I don't think I'd have enough time to talk about nervous signaling in detail as well. But you could obviously include that if you had more time. But I would say I've just put that as a bit of an importance question at the start this time rather than at the end. If an electrical impulse arrives at a neuromuscular junction, the sarcolemma is depolarized, which causes an influx of calcium ions. Calcium ions diffuse into myofibrils from the sarcoplasmic reticulum. They bind to and cause tropomyosin to move, exposing the binding sites on the actin. Myosin heads attach to binding sites on actin, forming an actin-myosin crossbridge. Energy stored in the myosin head transferred by ATP hydrolysis is transferred to kinetic energy as the myosin head bends, which pulls the actin filament along in the power stroke, shortening the sarcomere and contracting the muscle. A new ATP molecule attaches to the myosin head, causing it to detach from the actin binding site. Hydrolysis of ATP to ADP and inorganic phosphate by ATPase enzyme transfers the energy needed to recock the myosin head to its original position, ready to form a new bridge, a cross bridge at the next binding site. Then I go into my importance finally about this specific example. Without the binding of ATP, the actin-myosin cross-bridge would not be broken, and the muscle would remain in its contracted state, and the energy from the power stroke, which contracts the muscle fibers, would not be transferred to the myosin head. So I've got my energy transfer from ATP importance in muscle contraction in as well at the end of this paragraph. So you could then do a sum up if you wanted to, but you should have signposted enough as you went along with your essay that you should not need to do a sum up saying, oh, this essay has clearly shown that there are. You could do that first paragraph at the end if you wanted to, the little kind of sum up at the end instead, but we've covered plenty of topics. We've talked about detail. Again, this muscle contraction here is all A-level detail, that's correct. Same with the detail that we gave in the respiration paragraph. And it's linked, most importantly, we linked this like energy store, transferring of energy to kinetic energy to the movement of the myosin heads. That is clearly making links to the question as well. So that is the essay that I've written for energy transfers. Now let's have a look at like what other topics we could have maybe included and some tips on what to do and what not to do when you do your essay, and maybe to help you mark yours as well. Okay, so they don't give a mark scheme any more specific than the general mark scheme that we've already looked at. In the mark scheme for these questions, they will give you the topic list, which is not exclusive, so there are other things you may be able to include, but this is for the examiners. When they mark your essay, they'll put these little mark codes next to where you've talked about the various spec points, so they can easily see, have you covered 4 topics at a minimum? So we obviously talked about photosynthesis, we talked about energy transfers through ecosystems, we talked about respiration, we talked about ATP, we also talked about muscle contraction. So we've got at least 4, if not 5, spec points covered here. There are other things you could have said, obviously, and they're listed here. So you could have talked about absorption, so that's like active transport, basically, because you'd have to talk about energy. You couldn't talk about diffusion because it doesn't require energy. Mass transport we touched briefly on with this idea of ATP being used in muscle contraction for the heart, but also if you think about active loading in plant cells, and that's used for mass flow, that would be a lovely one to talk about here as well. Stimuli responses and nervous impulses again, so anything where you've got the use of the sodium potassium pump, which you can talk about for nervous impulses and stimuli responses, and that idea of energy being used and energy transfer. I think we've focused on the topics that are easiest here to relate to the question, and that's the thing. So what to avoid, this is taken from examiner reports that have marked whole cohorts of essays similar to this title, and these are kind of like the things that they stood out as the weak areas. So these are the things to avoid. So if you've done any of this, or you think you've done any of this in your essay, this is what kind of need to look out for to try and improve. So not focusing on the transfer of energy, because that is what is in the question. So describing energy, describing how ATP is made, but not, you could talk about all the things we talked about without using that phrase transfer of energy if you wanted to. But we made it very clear that we were talking about energy transfer when we were discussing our points. Not including both the transfer of energy within between the organisms, so not covering the whole question. The between organisms part really is limited to that idea of food chain. So if you avoided that, you wouldn't be answering the question. Talking about transfer of energy from organisms to their environment, so heat loss or something like that, that's irrelevant. It's not talking about the energy transfer between organisms and the environment. It was just inside organisms and between organisms. Some students made the mistake of covering all of respiration and photosynthesis, so just saying, here's everything I know and here's all the detail about all the parts of both, not being selective about where energy is being transferred and stored, mentioning energy stored in bonds and things like that, and being really specific about the bits of those processes that you're going to talk about to make sure you can focus on energy transfer. Spending too much time talking about ATP formation and not how the energy transferred by ATP is used in processes with examples. Not focusing on feeding relationships or focusing on feeding relationships without any reference to energy. So talking about predator-prey relationships or something like that. No, not relevant. Talking about nutrient cycles without linking energy transfers. This is really hard to do. So actually talking about energy transfers and the cycles, the nutrient cycles, and linking it to energy transfer is actually really, really difficult. So some people just kind of wrote all about energy and nutrient cycles, but didn't have any link to energy there. Okay. So hopefully that was helpful, and hopefully you've now kind of got an idea of what a model answer for those essays would look like. Obviously there's topics that I didn't include. If you want any help with writing the essay specifically, we have an essay workbook on the website that you can download that is based around kind of loads of different examples of essays and examples of content that you can include in different essay topics. I'd definitely say go and check it out. Have a go at writing the essay, then look and see what our model essay was and how it was marked and the examiner's comments. And you can pick out these kind of common errors and common mistakes and just make sure that you aren't someone that does that. And hopefully this has helped you kind of plan what you're going to do